Hey everybody, thanks for joining. I was watching the chat. I'm so excited to see some of the names in the chat. I've talked to so many of you in the comments, so it's great to see you here live. I want to say hi really quick to everybody I've seen so far: Christine, Precious Metal, Isaac Forbes, Polyhister, ASMR, Tingled Pink, LH, Tracy Dane, Sasha, Brian. Good to see you. Linda, Jane's World, Robin Welch. Hey Sharon. Anodyne, Hipster, Influencer. Hey everybody, KJ. Upstate Housewife, New York. Maya. Thanks for joining, everyone. I appreciate it. So it's all over, everyone. The defense has filed a motion here to challenge the grand jury's findings or proceedings, and they're using really powerful words like exculpatory, and we want a dismissal of the case. And if you read the headlines that are out there today, you would think, wow, this is going pretty good for Bryan, right? What do you think? Do you think this is going good for Bryan, everybody? The grand jury filing by the defense, kind of this pursuit of challenging the grand jury indictment. What do you think? Put a 1 if it's good for Bryan. Put a 2 if you think it's not good for Bryan. And then I'll let you know what I think. Brian says not sure. Pink says not good. Most people saying not good right now. KJ thinks it's looking good for Bryan. 1.5 for Bryan. Brian Hoffman here in the chat. So yeah, I think I agree with most people here. I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing for Bryan. I think it makes sense for the defense, but does it mean it's looking good for Bryan? I don't necessarily think that. I'll tell you why. Really quick though, let's take a look at that document just briefly. I'm not going to bore you with reading it word by word, but just a brief summary here. So the defense has filed this motion essentially where they're wanting more insights into the grand jury proceedings. They want to see, obviously, recordings and transcripts, but they're also wanting to know more about the jury. And I don't necessarily think this is so much about the evidence. One thing to keep in mind, everyone, is a grand jury is very different than a normal jury in a trial. A normal jury in a trial has a lot more responsibility. They're judging the guilt or innocence of the defendant. A grand jury is simply determining whether or not there's probable cause based off of the evidence being presented by the prosecution to send the case to trial. So their burden is much less. So when they assemble these grand juries, and they're looking at it a little different than a normal jury where somebody's life is on their line. So they're looking at the evidence and they're saying, okay, is this enough? Is this probable cause to pursue the trial here? And then they make a ruling on that. So one thing I do agree with here regarding the defense's filing is I do think that Bryan Kohberger does have a legal right to challenge the grand jury indictment. That is within his right. I think it's limited on what they're allowed to challenge. And I think most of the challenge is going to be centered around the actual jury and around how the evidence was potentially discovered. They're going to be looking for any breach in the legal process by the prosecution that would be grounds for a dismissal. So they're fishing to some extent here. But it is their right to do that. They can challenge it to some extent. So what they're going to be looking to do here is potentially they want to know who the jurors are, and they want to make sure that those jurors aren't biased, and they're really going to be pushing this narrative of the media as being biased against Bryan. They've already mentioned that in these legal filings and these other documents where they're they've submitted a filing here, a motion that just says all of these. They cited all of these media articles, and they said that this is essentially here. I'll show you the document here actually, but they're basically saying this is. We would like the court to notice these news articles, and because this is something that we're going to be talking about later on as we present our defense, and they're referencing the media's bias against Bryan. And they're citing multiple articles in that motion. So they're really going to be pushing, I think, here that this jury pool in the grand jury could have been tainted, and they're going to be looking for a loophole there, a way to get the case right. They think they're going to get the case dismissed. I don't think that's going to happen, but this is kind of what the angle is. Just going to briefly look here and see if I can find that document. But essentially, they're just arguing that the media, is being unfair, and all of the information out there is against Bryan. Well, they obviously don't get on YouTube, right? Because it's funny, I'll post a video and share some opinions that I have, and there's quite a few people out there who have a different opinion than I do, in the comments. And so by saying that the jury pool is tainted, I think there's a balance of people out there on guilt, and then there's people who argue his innocence. But the thing that you'll be surprised about is in a jury pool, how many people out there don't know about the Bryan Kohberger case. And I don't know about how many of you, but part of why I created this channel is because I need more people to talk to about true crime. I have, people I interact with in my day-to-day, and I'll bring up the Bryan Kohberger case, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. They haven't heard of it. I'm sure it's a little different in Moscow. More people have probably heard of it, but there are people out there who aren't familiar with the case like most of us are, and who follow the case. Welcome, Bridget. Thanks for subscribing. So, it is possible to assemble a jury of people who haven't been exposed to the case as much, or, aren't aware of the case at all. So, but the defense has a right, to look to try to challenge that and look for that. Now, the other thing regarding the grand jury is I believe you can have up to 23 people selected in a grand jury, and so they're not going to necessarily use all 23. But if the defense, for example, were to find an issue with one of the jurors in this motion that they have, as long as the grand jury consisted of a total of 12 who agreed with the decision, it can still proceed. So it's really rare for the defense to get a grand jury indictment overturned. It's a very, very rare thing in the legal process. It's not impossible. It has happened, but it is a very rare thing. And, I think, a lot, again, they're using these words like, oh, they may have exculpatory evidence and we want to seek grounds for dismissal. You would think that, wow, they have something, right? They must have something to prove his innocence, or they know about something that the prosecution's hiding. And that's not the case. And this is why I think this is bad for Bryan, because this is legal process 101, what they're doing here. And so what I'm talking about is, so if you do a little bit of research on kind of just tactics of defense attorneys, this is pretty much standard quo to what they're supposed to do if you have a defendant who's been indicted by a grand jury. So at this point, they have a choice, right? They can go to trial and they can argue their case in the trial, or before the trial, they can pursue an argument against the grand jury indictment. It's an avenue that they have available to them. It's like, in baseball, if the more swings, the better. If you can foul off a pitch, you get another swing. And so the more swings they have at poking a hole in the prosecution's case, the better for the defendant. So it's legal process 101 for the defense here to be filing this motion to challenge the grand jury proceedings. Any competent defense lawyer defending a death penalty case with somebody's life on the line should be pursuing this avenue. That would make sense, right? And Taylor is a competent attorney. They know what they're doing here, and they're going to leverage every angle of the legal process that they can. But they're a little bit limited on what they can challenge. They can't try their case, with this motion. They can't challenge all of the evidence, and that's what the trial is for. But they can challenge, if they can get insights into the evidence, they could potentially find process errors, for example, that could result in a big mistake. If the prosecution made a big mistake here and dropped the ball and completely, submitted this evidence the wrong way outside of the legal process, then that's on them. But that's what the defense is looking for, and that's what they should be looking for. But they're going to be wanting to gain insight into the jurors, and I think they're really going to focus on that angle of this jury pool could have been tainted and try to find an avenue there. Let's check out the chat here really quick. Sasha says it's a little bit late to be objecting to the grand jury. That's a good point. Now they're, typically the defense, and it's not necessarily the defense's fault. This was a secretive grand jury, so the defense wasn't even aware of this, and so they didn't have an opportunity to challenge it. So they're challenging it after the fact, after they've learned of it. But that's the game they're playing here. They're trying to just get as many swings as they can to poke a hole in this prosecution's case, to save Bryan. Tracy Dane says, I think she believes his story that he is innocent. Yeah, that one drives me crazy, Tracy Dane. That's definitely one of the questions that eats at me. I want to know, I really wish I knew what Ann Taylor really believed. Does she believe his innocence, or is she just doing her job? That's really one interesting aspect of this case, in my opinion, just with this high-profile case and the details of the crime, and having to sit there face-to-face with potentially the person who committed that crime. It's a big difference if you believe he's innocent versus if you believe he's guilty, on when she's going to bed at night, what's going through her mind. So Catherine has a great point here as well. She says their backs are against the wall if they really have nothing working for them. So they're looking for something. So that's a great point, because I wanted to show you, there's a legal document I came across here. And this is from, there's all kinds of different legal sites you can go to read about some of this, but it's interesting because this is what I was referring to as being Legal 101. This is where, the defense is kind of expected to do this, and it says these are defense strategies following a federal grand jury indictment. It says once an indictment has been issued, defense efforts must focus on avoiding a conviction at trial. While this may ultimately mean executing a trial strategy in federal district court, there are other possibilities as well. So depending on the circumstances involved, some defense strategies are filing a motion to dismiss the indictment. So this isn't something that Bryan Kohberger and his team just came up with, this kind of genius thing where they're like, ooh, we're gonna cut him off, at the pass and attack the indictment. This is standard. So you can see here that most of the focus here is going to be bias or prejudice of the grand jury, right? So they're going to be really looking closely at that bias of the grand jury. And then we have another one here of prejudicial publicity. And this is what they're going after. The defense here is going to be really trying to leverage all of the media coverage of Bryan. Remember, they were complaining about the cameras in the court and how everybody was examining Bryan. And so they're going to say to the courts, hey, look at all of these articles saying Bryan's guilty. Everybody thinks Bryan's guilty. We want to see that jury pool. And then there could be things like failure to present exculpatory evidence. Now, it doesn't mean there is any exculpatory evidence. It doesn't mean that they failed to present any exculpatory evidence, but the defense wants to look at it to check. That's their job, right? They want to try to find something. Now, the state, the prosecution, they're all trained as well on how to file these charges and how to navigate these proceedings by following the rules. So the expectation is they did just that, and they followed the rules, and they did things the right way here. But yeah, the defense is doing their diligence here, and they're going to put the prosecution to the fire, and they're going to make sure that they did things right. And like I've said before, does that prove any innocence of Bryan? Not necessarily. But can it get his life saved, and can it, is it an effective defense strategy? Maybe. But to the point I mentioned earlier about the comment there, it essentially says here that once somebody's been indicted by a grand jury, the chances are pretty slim that they're probably going to be found innocent. There's a pretty good case against that person in most cases. Here you had a jury of 12, think about this too, a preliminary hearing where it's essentially the same thing, except for the judge is determining whether or not it's going to go to trial. In this case, it's a jury of people determining whether or not it's going to go to trial. So I don't know what's better, a better sign or not. Is it better to have one person, a judge, look at it and say, yeah, I think there's enough evidence here to send this to trial? Or the fact that you had a jury of 12 citizens looking at the evidence and saying, yep, there's probable cause here to send this to trial. So most likely it was an unbiased jury, and most likely they saw the evidence and they determined that there's enough there. But the defense sure does want to find out and see if there was a mistake made anywhere. So Robin Welch, yeah, you say, why is an alibi so difficult if he's innocent? Agreed. That was, we talked about that in a recent video as well. I agree with you. They're definitely looking for a lot of, legal things to try to find a way to get the case thrown out and things like that, rather than presenting an alibi or a defense or an explanation on where he was that night. And that kind of ties in with my point about Bryan's actions and how maybe an innocent person might act versus a guilty person. The attorney of an innocent person could maybe say, yeah, my client didn't do it. They have a solid alibi. They were somewhere. They don't have to reveal what it is, but they could make a statement, right? And say, yeah, but with the gag order and everything, all of that's locked down, which the defense is arguing to keep in place. They want the gag order in place because they don't have any defense to offer. But you would think that an innocent person, you would just explain what you were doing that night and work with law enforcement in order to prove your innocence. Why would you be, shutting down and not trying to prove your innocence? It's crazy to me. Yeah. Pam Haggart says an innocent person doesn't separate their trash in the middle of the night wearing gloves. Yeah. If it's true, we heard it. We just have to be careful. Some bits of information are released here and there. And it does make sense because one thing is there is a piece of evidence kind of supporting that, because they did find gloves in Bryan's pocket when they arrested him in Pennsylvania. So that was one of the things that was listed on the intake of Bryan's belongings. It was a couple of sets of gloves. So when you think about, okay, is that a legit piece of information that we heard about? Possibly. He had gloves on him. We know that. So why would he have had gloves on him? That would make sense. So that's the kind of stuff I like to try to figure out, where you actually have kind of a clue there, or a piece of the actual information that's been released that ties into some of those things that we hear, and then then figuring out if that's true or not. So Brian Hoffman says he may have wore gloves way before the trial. Yeah, like Howie Mandel, right? He wears gloves all the time. He has a condition where he's doesn't like touching things or people touching him. He wears gloves. I don't know if Bryan has that condition, but it's a good point. He may have. So Lori Gennaro was asking about the ID in the glove box in the closet. We haven't heard anything about that, anything new. We just heard, there was a release of information that they had that there was an ID found potentially of one of the victims, but we really don't know for sure. That's not listed in the affidavit. It's not listed in any of these documents that we've come across. We do see, in the items that were seized, that they're noted as IDs in a glove in a box, and so it is possible there are IDs out there. Whose IDs they are, they haven't told us that yet. We don't know for sure. Yep, hit the like, everyone. Thanks. So yeah, so speaking of the evidence that was picked up, from when Bryan was arrested, I'll show you that really quick, what I was talking about there. I'll put the links as well for everybody to these two sites where I go for these documents. I'll link these in the description after this video. And you can come here too if you ever want to review these. I'll link it right to this page for y'all. Let me see if I can find the one where it had what was in Bryan's pockets here. Okay, so this is going to be from the house here, I believe. They mixed it up. One of them says car, one says house, but the documents are actually, I think, different. So here we go. So this is what it looks like Bryan had in his possession when he was taken into custody. So he had a flashlight. Could have been a bedside flashlight. Could have been a little pocket flashlight. But in the middle of the night, he had a flashlight on him. 4 medical style gloves. So not just one pair. He had multiple pairs. So he could have had a few pairs in his pockets to take off, and then he puts on a new pair. And then he was just wearing a shirt, sweatshirt. It appears he wears a size 13 shoe. So that'll be interesting. If they did find any additional footprints, obviously they have his foot size. Are they a size 13 in the house? It's a pretty big shoe print, pretty big footprint. He had some black Under Armour socks on, some shorts. And then they took some DNA swabs from him. So, he was kind of in his, probably sleeping attire, had a sweatshirt on, maybe put a sweatshirt on when they were taking him into custody, but this is what he was wearing. But he did have the medical style gloves. There's a lot of stuff that was taken from the house in Pennsylvania. A lot of it's hard to read. A lot of devices. So they're going to have a lot of devices to be pulling information off of hard drives and things like that. Whether or not they were Bryan's or they could have been older. But there's a lot of information to go through. All these different laptops and computers take time to process. They haven't released any information about finding the actual knife. They do have listed here a couple of knives that were taken. It is interesting that they list this one as just knife, where later they actually name the brand of the knife, but maybe this knife just didn't have any markings. A lot of clothing. And that was another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight too. I wanted to take a quick look at the crime scene because I wanted to piggyback a little bit off of my last live and talk about, sorry, I didn't even have that screen up for you. Talk about, kind of how some of that DNA transfer could have happened that I was mentioning in the last video. But there's a lot of clothing that was taken from the home, at least what's been released to us. So we don't know if anything's been redacted here, if this is everything, but a lot of clothing that they're going to have, fibers and things like that. Some books. We still don't know, the page 18 underlining book. A Man's Mind Drawing. I do have a video about that. I do think that's really interesting, and it does tie into some other theories that I have about Bryan's motive. We've seen a lot of way back a few months back, I had come up with some ideas, about Bryan's kind of internal motives and his views on society and women and things like that. And I had a couple videos, but when I saw that A Man's Mind drawing, it lined up quite a bit with Freud and things like that. Some of the same kind of similar ideologies referenced in my past videos. So I'm intrigued by the A Man's Mind drawing and why that was taken. I do think, though, it's possible that because that drawing does depict a naked woman kind of as part of the drawing, law enforcement may have been instructed to seize anything that could even slightly be considered nudity or pornography. So when they see a drawing with a nude woman, they might just say, "Oh, yep, we're taking that." So, but I'm interested with that, insights about that drawing. But there's the ID cards inside glove, inside box. So I've heard some say that, well, maybe it meant, ID cards inside the glove box. It could be, we don't know, but it is interesting the way it's written. ID cards inside glove, inside box. And it doesn't appear to me that this would have been things taken from his vehicle. I don't think that he would have had all of these electronic devices, the firearm, the record of the sale of this appears to me to be things that were taken from the house, despite it saying on the site that it was taken from the vehicle. There's the note from Bryan from Montana. A shop vac. Medical and court documents. A note to Dad from Bryan. Notebooks. They took some swabs again. And then a couple of pairs of dark colored boots, a pair of brown boots. So again, a lot of clothing, a lot of electronic devices. We don't know if this is everything they took or not. But when you talk about the clothing and things like that, right? And it's not just that they're thinking, well, could there be blood on the clothing? There could also be fibers from that clothing left behind at the crime scene. So if we look at, let's take a look really quick at King Road. I'm going to check the comments, and then we'll take a quick look here at King Road at the house at the crime scene, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about regarding that transfer. Letty C says, I wonder when the FBI watched him clean his car and if they took the garbage after. I wonder that also. We do know that they were surveilling him for a few days, but what he was doing, we don't know. But very possible that they were surveilling him and he was cleaning things up. I just wonder if he maybe would have already cleaned up before getting to Pennsylvania. He could have been doing some additional cleanup, thinking he was, under the radar out there, but very possible. I think it's also possible that after uncovering GPS data and things like that from his devices, they could find video footage and things like that, maybe of him disposing of evidence. I would imagine there's a lot of camera footage out there. I agree with Brian Hoffman there. Lori said, who says clad in black? I think that's law enforcement describing what the witness said. I don't think that's necessarily verbatim how Dylan described him. And some people were saying too, how could he, just in black? How would he not have been covered in blood? We don't know, right? We don't know if he had blood on him. Your clothing is absorbent, so the blood's not necessarily going to be dripping off of him, right? So, but just because it's not released in the affidavit doesn't mean that it wasn't described as being seen, right? I don't know if it could have been dark, but just keep in mind, they don't release everything in the affidavit. Hey, Bradley, good to see you. Hey, Sylvia, thanks for watching. Glad you like it, Sylvia. Yeah, so driving across the country, you would clean up your car, right? Yeah, it's not abnormal to clean your car. I think the key there is, could they have found something afterward? All right, so let's take a quick look here at the house, and I'll explain what I was talking about the evidence. Hopefully this site loads well for us. No buffering tonight, everybody. It's been a lot better. I think I got it figured out. My settings, I had it on the wrong display settings, and I think it was just overloading it, so it seems to be running a lot better. All right. Let's pull that up for us. Here we go. Really quick too, I wanted to mention, we were talking about Bryan being on camera. And so there's been discussion about the neighbor's camera that picked up the audio and potentially video footage. But there's a lot of video footage out there apparently that has been is in the custody of law enforcement. So there's descriptions in the affidavit of, the neighborhood, the entire neighborhood, certain places in the neighborhood having cameras that they're looking at. So, and as close as right next door potentially. So let's go inside here. So the thing I wanted to point out here about this is the way the house is laid out. And you can see everywhere in this house is kind of close proximity, close quarters, There's not a lot of big open areas. And, think about the size of Bryan. Think about the size of Ethan. Ethan was a pretty big person as well. Multiple people in these kind of confined quarters here. Now, this is the first floor. This would have been where Bethany was sleeping. So there weren't any attacks down here that we're aware of. So the living room here is the most open space that there is. Now, we haven't heard of any attacks happening here in this kind of open area in the living room. So we have heard of potential attacks happening in this hallway over here by Xana's room. So if the attacks happened in this area, it's all really close quarters. So just kind of picture somebody the size of Bryan and another person in this space here with this struggle going on, with multiple stab wounds happening, and potentially Xana, for example, with defensive wounds, putting her hands up in this kind of struggle. So, it's not just necessarily skin cells or hair that could be left behind, but even clothing fibers could be left behind potentially. So when they seize that clothing, could anything there match? Now, I don't know about clothing because I think Bryan would have gotten rid of any clothing. So hopefully there's some skin cells under the fingernails of the victims. But in these close quarters here, I think the chances are pretty good that some hair or some skin cells, something could have been transferred onto the victims in some way. Remember, blood is very sticky also. So blood could pick up hairs and things, and even I wonder if, I don't know about how it works with DNA on if you take blood and then you add, for example, skin cells from somebody else to the blood, can they detect that or not? I'll have to look into that more. But in this kind of messy struggle, you would think there could be some transfer. And then even in Xana's bedroom here, it's a pretty small bedroom. Ethan's a pretty big person if the attacks happened here in the bedroom. Let me turn this around. So it's really close quarters, right? All of these encounters were very close and extremely violent, right? We've heard the crime scene was a massacre, so very messy. And then if we just go up to Maddie's room here, you can see Maddie's room is also very close quarters, and two of the victims were found in this room. And then imagine a large person like Bryan. We've heard the wounds were very brutal, so you would imagine this kind of horrible scene unfolding here. So I think there's a very good chance that there could have been a transfer of some additional DNA that they could find on the victims later on. And then it made me think a little bit also about footprints, because somebody had put in the comments that I thought was interesting is, why the lack of, footprints? Well, one, I think there might be more footprints than we know about, but two, if, Bryan's standing up during the attacks and he's stationary and he's maybe taking small steps, there's going to be some blood. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be at the point of where it's pooled yet on the ground. I think a lot of that blood that they're talking about at the scene definitely happened a little bit after the actual attacks, while the victims were lying there and they were bleeding. Definitely that blood is going to, spread and become more. But in the moment of the actual attacks, stab wounds are very fast. Knife attacks are very quick. These aren't, I think that there's this misperception of the perpetrator standing there like in, for these long periods of, like, this took a long time. These were quick attacks, and so there's literally multiple stab wounds before the other stab wounds are fully bleeding, right? But what happens is you have this kind of, you can hit arteries and things, so blood can come out more rapidly in different directions, but it doesn't necessarily pool on the ground, right, where he's going to be stepping in it and then tracking it all through the house. That would be more something maybe after the victims are lying on the ground and he's walking around the victims type of a thing. Now there could be a small amount, but I think that could be why, we're not seeing these kind of like footprints outside leading away. I think these attacks were sudden, they were quick, and I don't think there was necessarily a lot of blood right under Bryan's feet during the attacks. So very close quarters in the house here, and I think law enforcement has a lot to sort through DNA wise. Take a look at the chat again. Interesting. Elon Raphael says when people are stabbed, it actually takes a lot of strength to pull the knife back out. Yeah, Natmon, very quick. Yeah, so Jane's World, you mentioned the Delphi case. I'm interested in that one here. I am going to talk a little bit about that. I'm actually going to be hanging out with what we call the precinct with my members on Sunday night. We have a members live that we'll be doing. If anybody's interested in that, I'll link that in the description as well if you'd like to become a member. It's just kind of an extra fun thing that they allow us to do with the channel. But the cool thing that we're going to do with it is it's a subscription thing, so you have to pay, I think it's like $4 or $5 a month. But what I do is I take any of those fees and I do giveaways on the members only lives, and we just give those membership fees back to all of the members, and it makes it kind of fun when we get on those lives. So reach out if you're interested in that, and I'll post that in the description for you. It's a lot of fun. It's fun to hang out with a smaller group and talk about different cases. But I did want to talk a little bit about the Delphi case on Sunday evening, and also share some thoughts that I had on the Summer Wells case. HK Schubert, you made it. I had you in mind, HK, when I scheduled this one. I tried to push it out a little bit later because I saw your comment that you're not available until later in the evening, so I'm glad you make it. Thanks, Pink. Yep, can't wait to see you there. The other cool thing about being a member, everybody, is you get a little logo. If you look at Pink's name there in the comments, you can see she's a recent member, so she's still a white belt. She's got the white logo. But the longer you're a member, you get a new logo. If you look at Bradley, I believe he's got the purple belt. He's got the purple logo. So it makes it a little bit fun. So Natmon, yeah, so, there's the whole, I think the drug angle argument. I really think that is, and you've probably all heard me before talk about this, but I really think that that's kind of these kind of outside rumors flying around. I mean, there has been literally no mention of anything drug related in any document that we've seen in this case, not even from the defense, pursuing that. Of course, things are under wraps, but there just hasn't been any tie to it. It's, I know there's a lot of, things flying around, and I'm sure there was drug use and things like that going on in the town and that, but me personally, I don't think it was to the extent of, being having anything to do with the crime. Thank you. I appreciate that. Hey, Marietta, good to see you. Thank you, Molly. Appreciate that. So Stacy said, had to take a break from Delphi today and put yourself in a timeout. Yeah, that's a wild one. So what I read there is they're going to be going after that bullet evidence. And so, interesting. I also saw a really interesting comment that somebody posted that mentioned, because I had talked about the fact that Bryan did not come forward regarding the wide Elantra, but in that Delphi case, it sounds like, he did come forward to some extent. So it adds an interesting variable there on the mind of somebody being accused, right? Yeah, Brian Huffman, you might be surprised. I do have a little more experience than you might think with drug environments. I'm a little bit older maybe than I look, but I've not necessarily been, personally, but I've been around quite a bit in different ways. And like I said, I understand, that these are college students, and I'm sure that there's drug use going on to some extent. But I think college drug use is a little bit different than lifestyle drug use. And then when you get into, the next level of actually dealing drugs outside of, through this sorority house, I don't see it. I'm not saying that it's not possible. From everything that I've looked at in this, I don't see that with the victims. And, when we look at, Kaylee's diary entries, this girl had a good head on her shoulders, and you look at the posts and all of this, they were living the college life. They weren't necessarily living a drug dealer life from anything out there that we've seen. Sure, was there some partying going on? Absolutely, I'm sure there was. But I don't think it's to the extent of the level of escalating to a murder in any way. I think any partying or anything like that may have been going on was just that. I don't think it's related to the crime. It's scary. There's a lot of problems in a lot of places right now with drugs, and so there's a lot of drugs out there. If you were to just look into Moscow or any other small cities out there, you'd be surprised at how much drug use there is. So there's drugs all over the place. It doesn't necessarily mean that these girls were. The other thing is, these are girls, Kaylee, for example, she's about to graduate with a bachelor's degree. She's got a new job lined up, just bought a new car. She has goals set. Those aren't things that drug users and drug dealers are focused on, right? They're focused on other things. And so that's just a little bit of insight into her. She was living there. So is she really going to have her, be in that environment of drug sales? There's nothing showing Maddie being in that environment. Bethany, nobody really talks about her. So yeah, I know it's very controversial out there. It's just one of these things that started up really early on with, the surviving roommates. Right off the bat, they were suspects. Like, whoa, these two roommates, before we knew anything about who anybody was. It was right off the bat, whoa, these surviving roommates. And then we kind of learned more. And then early on, there was these like rumors out there about drug use and things like that. And it just continued on. And I think there's some validity to the drug use in the area. But enough on that. But I'm definitely open to seeing some hard evidence that actually says, okay, yeah, there is a connection. I'm still looking for it, is all. So if anybody has it, send it my way. It would be great, right? Imagine if we could find something solid, right, that actually points to a different answer here. I mean, we're all in pursuit of the truth, right? That's why we like True Crime Time. It's that mystery of wanting to know what really happened. So I don't think any of us would deny the right answer. But this is a crazy case. There's just so much to kind of dispute and go back and forth and try to figure out. That's why we're all here, right? Hanging out, talking about it. I really appreciate you all joining too. I'm going to hang out here for a little bit longer and just kind of respond to the comments, chat with you all. So if you have any questions for me, drop it in there. Any ideas, anything you want us to take a look at more closely and do a live on and talk about more, drop it in the comments. I'm always open to ideas. Yeah, so Molly B. Denham says drug addicts have a certain look. Agree. Yep, they were well dressed and healthy looking. So Christine Sky, yeah, I do have a couple of theories on why she waited. I do have a video on that on one reason where it goes into detail around traumatic shock. But I do think that there are a couple of other answers there, and I think that the question has been answered for law enforcement. I think potentially Kaylee's family knows the answer of what happened in those hours. But check out my previous lives where I actually I do go into that in detail on my thoughts about the hours after the murders. Yeah, so ASMR Tingled Pink, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that yet. So you said, just wondering if by some chance they did overturn the grand jury indictment, would they be able to bring up charges on him again? Not quite sure on that. That was one thing I was trying to find out. So I'll continue to look into that and I'll try to get that answer. My thought is, I don't know if at that point, right, it would go to a preliminary hearing and to a judge, or if that's just, and I think it would depend on the reason for it being overturned. So for example, if they found that the state or the prosecution just did something incorrectly, right, and regarding the evidence, that could result in it being done. But I think it's going to be, if it's something where, there's an issue with a juror, and I don't even see that happening because it just says they have to have at least 12. So even if they found an issue with one juror, I think potentially they have others. But I really think it would have to be something that's connected to mishandling of evidence, that in order for it to actually end up in like an overturned situation. Dismissal, Yeah, very small chance. It's super rare. That again, that's the difference, right? I don't know what's better, just one person looking at your case and deciding your fate on if there's enough there to send it to trial, or would you rather have 12 people looking at it, and all 12 you have to have agreement to have it go to trial? Let me know about that in the chat, everybody. Put a 1 if you want one person looking at your case, and put a 2 if you would prefer a group of 12 people looking at the evidence and determining if there's enough there to send it to trial. What are your thoughts? Do you want just a judge deciding your fate, or would you prefer 12? And I think we would prefer 12 because it feels more fair, right? It feels like bringing 12 together. You could have one biased person, but 12 people, you'd have to have multiple people there. So the fact that the grand jury indicted him and it's going to trial, that tells us something, right? So this jury said, yep, there's probable cause here. They've got some pretty strong evidence, I think. Yeah, so St. Jenny, I really like him. I like the lawyer, he's a good dude. He's very busy, and but he's a sharp guy. If you guys do want legal insight, he does cover the Kohberger case. He's a good one to watch. Yeah, so 22 banks. It's a good question, Brian. That's something we should explore a bit more. The bank accounts, multiple bank accounts. There's 4 people. Um, I don't know if necessarily all of the victims had accounts at all of those banks, if that's what you're referring to there. It's interesting, though. Yeah, so the original Alexa, that's a great point. The difference, right, between the grand jury and a preliminary hearing is the defense isn't involved. And so in a preliminary hearing, the defense gets to argue against, right, the evidence, and then the judge has to determine whether or not, it's going to go to trial. Great point. Yeah, so I don't know, bank accounts. Good question. I don't know if it's credit card related. Sometimes people have credit cards that could be connected to a bank, and maybe those warrants are, looking into the actual banks. Good question, though. I'll have to look at. I want to look back at those documents and kind of review that again, Brian, and I will. I'll get back to you. I know you've got my email there, so we'll look at that one. Lori says moving money for someone. Christine Sky, I think Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was referring to the warrants that have been filed in looking into the bank accounts. SB 9381 mentions being in a house filled with people who have bled out, not calling law enforcement for 8 hours, but calling a sorority. It's negligence. Well, I don't know. I mean, we don't know what happened to Dylan. She could have experienced a medical condition, right? She could have called people earlier that we don't know about. Now, one thing I do want to clarify about calling. Now, we don't know if she called the sorority or not. That's a rumor. I don't know if that's been validated. But one thing that does happen with people who experience traumatic shock is they will reach out to other people before calling 911. So your body goes into this survival mode, and you will actually call other people, friends and family, before calling law enforcement for help. It's just a way that people's bodies react to traumatic situations. If you do some research and look into traumatic shock, that is an actual symptom, documented symptom of that. Psychologically, they're falling back on kind of their instincts, and they're turning to the people who are the comforts for them for help. And so when they're in this survival mode, that's what they subconsciously do rather than calling 911. It's weird, yes, I get it. But people do unusual things when those types of things happen to them. But there's so much to discuss in this case, with all these different theories. And the one thing I also have a hard time is with, with the drug theories, is how it's changed every time. It's one thing if from the very beginning it was, yep, Dylan was doing it. It's changed multiple times. The story and the rumors have jumped around. Whatever kind of the popular topic was, that's who was dealing drugs. At Dylan, it was at one point. Then you had Xana. Then it was because Xana's mom owed money to people. And then briefly it was Xana's dad. People were even looking into Xana's dad's criminal records. Then all of a sudden Emma Bailey, popped up. And so we're just jumping from kind of, theory to theory, which one, so. Yeah, and we don't know, Lori, like she may have called other people, and those other people could have been caring for her and didn't necessarily call 911 right away. I don't think there's a criminal explanation to those hours. Law enforcement knows what happened. They've spoken to them. The family of Kaylee, from what we've heard, he's spoken to them. And he, in his own words, said if he saw them, he would give them a hug, and he wishes he could protect them from everything. And it sounded to me when Stephen Gonsalves said that is they're trying to keep quiet because they are going to be key witnesses in this case. And I think that those hours after the crimes eventually are going to come out, but I don't think it's going to be a criminal thing, And if she, maybe they did respond in the wrong way, they're you got to keep in mind they just experienced a mass murder. I mean, would you if there was a school shooting and these students were huddling in a classroom and they didn't call 911, how many students, when a school shooting starts, not every student's calling 911, right? You have some people who call in, but most of them are in survival mode. So are you going to blame all of those students who are in a school shooting for not calling 911 or reacting the way that we think that they should react? Or why didn't you save that person? Or, not everybody's a hero, right? Not everybody's capable of that. And everybody reacts to trauma and things in a different way. So yeah, maybe she didn't handle it right. Maybe, they didn't call. Maybe they didn't know what to do, or, whatever. But does that mean that it has anything connected to the crime? And, is she a drug dealer? Is she an accomplice to murder? I don't think that it goes to that. Yeah, Molly, I mean, to wake up to that, or even to hear it, or, Yeah, Bradley, I think that's, students these days are trained to go into lockdown mode. Wait for help, right? Maybe she didn't have her phone, possibly. So many questions, though, right? No, none of us have the answer. But that's why we're here, to try to figure it out. Yeah, so Christine Stegman says in survival mode, we don't think, right? You just, you save. And your mind is racing. Your mind is jumping, and you're processing things, super fast. And I told a story in my last live of when I was a kid and I had a scary situation, and my initial thought was, I'm going to go, and I was literally right next to a phone. I could have called 911, but my thought was, I'm going to go hide. I was scared. And then as I was sitting there hiding after a little while, I said, screw that. I'm not going to hide anymore for them to find me. I'm going to take off and get out of here. And I ran out of the house that I was at. And so you're in those urgent situations, it's scary. You might do one thing initially and then do something else later. So maybe she hid for a while. Imagine, it doesn't necessarily mean she was in the house for the full 7 hours either. She could have stayed hidden for a couple of hours and then said, man, I'm getting out of here. It's quiet. It's like, I'm going to run to my friends for help. And then she goes to some friends, and then it takes them a couple of hours to kind of, gather everybody and figure out what's going on. And then they call 911. Again, that's just another theory aside from she's connected to the crime, right? So there's so many things that could have happened out there in those hours, afterward. It's not just one thing that could have happened. It could have been a series of events that unfolded in those hours that are explainable. So Christine Sky mentions, calling sooner. So from the description of the injuries, it doesn't sound like calling 911 would have necessarily saved him at the point from when Dylan realized what was happening. And I don't think it's necessarily her fault either, because like I said, not everybody is a hero. She is a victim in the case, in my opinion. This was a traumatic experience, what was happening there. I believe that she was aware of what was occurring outside of her bedroom door, and I think that that played a part into the way she acted. So by saying that, had she have called sooner, could be different. Maybe it could have been different, but you can't really blame her, right? Had she ran out and tackled Bryan in the kitchen and held him down and pulled his hair out and got evidence, could things have been different? Sure, but it didn't happen, right? She responded the way that she responded, and I don't necessarily think that it's fair to blame her, because we don't know how she responded. We're assuming that she either just ignored it. We have probably 3-4 different theories there, but we really don't know. I was also talking to somebody too a little bit about the dynamic of this case, and it's interesting. I was doing my live last night, and I was reading a portion of Kaylee's diary where she was describing her friends and listing her friends, and I actually felt a little bit choked up when I was reading that, and just the kind of person that she was, and then it reminded me a little bit of early on in this case, and why we were all so, I guess, intrigued by this case was, it was, the victims were a big part of that. We just, whatever it was, just kind of touched us about these victims. And then, as time has gone on, that's kind of gone to the back burner a little bit. And, when I was doing that live last night and reading through that, I was kind of reminded of that. It's like, wow, I remember, that was a big part of why I became so interested in this case, is for whatever reason, these four victims being involved, I think a lot of us, for maybe we all don't know why, but we were intrigued by this case. And then for whatever reason, I don't understand why the two survivors aren't being seen as, they could have very easily been those pictures that we're looking at, right? In all of these videos that we're doing, those two survivors we could be looking at them as victims as well. So I just, I'm slow to kind of blame them. Now, if there's some evidence out there that comes out that shows they did something criminal, well, then that's a different thing. But until we know more, that's kind of my thoughts. Everybody, it was great to hang out with you tonight. I will be doing a lot more lives. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss them. I don't know if YouTube notifications work or not. It seems like they do half the time. Half the time they don't. I try to post a little message to everybody when I'll be jumping on live, but I do like these later night lives, so I do plan to do more of these. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. If there's a different time that you'd like me to do a live, I'm up for experimenting. But I do like these late night lives. It's fun to hang out with everybody and talk. I'll be on here again really soon, and I'll talk to you all then. Have a good night, everyone.